Sarah was sharpening her hunting knife when the summons arrived. She had been on border patrol for 3 weeks, walking the frost-edged perimeter of Ironvale territory, sleeping in rotation with 2 other scouts, eating dried meat and hard bread, and telling herself this was fine, that this was enough, that an Omega without a pack didn't get to want more than enough. The messenger found her at dawn, a young wolf, barely 16, wearing the silver thread livery she recognized immediately, not from Ironvale, from somewhere far older, far more powerful. He held out a folded letter sealed in black wax, stamped with a wolf mid-leap. The royal seal. Her hands didn't shake when she took it. She had trained herself out of shaking years ago. The letter was short. Packlaw didn't waste words on Omegas. By command of His Majesty King Aldrich Vane, Alpha of the 7 bloodlines, Sarah of no pack is summoned to appear before the throne for private audience. Transport departs at dawn tomorrow. This summons may not be refused or delayed. Sarah, read it 3 times. She was nobody. She had been nobody for 2 years, since Ironvale cast her out with nothing but the clothes she wore and a wound in her side that had taken 6 weeks to heal. She had no pack name, no territory, no standing in any council of any kind. An Alpha King did not summon nobodies. This has to be a mistake. But the seal was real. She had seen it enough times at Ironvale's treaty meetings to know the difference. She folded the letter, tucked it inside her coat, and kept sharpening her knife. If it was a mistake, she would find out when she arrived. If it wasn't, she would find out then, too. For Part 1. The woman they cast out. Her name was Sarah, and before anything else happens, you need to understand what kind of woman she was before the summons, before the king, before any of what comes next. She was not what Ironvale Pack said she was. She had never been what they said she was. Ironvale had decided Sarah was difficult in her first season among them, and had spent the following 4 years finding ways to prove themselves right. In Ironvale's language, difficult meant she asked questions that made people uncomfortable, that she noticed things the Alpha preferred left unnoticed, that she had the specific, dangerous quality of a person who could not be made to see something that wasn't there. She was 25, the daughter of a wandering Omega healer who had died when she was 17, leaving her with field medicine, in wilderness survival, and the ability to read weather 3 days ahead. She had earned her place in Ironvale through sheer competence. She was one of their best trackers, faster than most betas, more accurate in difficult terrain than wolves with twice her experience. She had saved 4 pack members from a rockfall. She had brought down a stag in a whiteout that had turned 3 senior hunters back. She had identified a sickness moving through the eastern settlement 2 weeks before the pack physician did. When she identified the sickness, she was told she was catastrophizing. When the sickness spread and she was right, no one remembered she'd said anything. She learned to stop saying things. What she did not learn, what she was constitutionally unable to learn, was to look away when something was wrong. The Alpha of Ironvale was a man named Darren. Broad, certain, the kind of man who had decided what the world was at 20 and had spent every year since defending that decision. He was not cruel in the obvious ways. He was cruel in the administrative ways, the ones that don't leave marks, the resource allocations that consistently shorted the eastern settlement, the patrol assignments that kept inconvenient wolves far from the center of power, the council decisions made in rooms that were never quite as private as they were supposed to be. Sarah saw it. She said so once, to a beta she had trusted. The beta told Darren. Darren smiled at her across the council fire that same evening, and did not change his expression when he spoke. "Our border scouts report the western passes are understaffed," he said. "Sarah will take the next rotation. The western passes in deepest winter. Alone. She went. She survived. She came back. He sent her again. She survived again. The 3rd time, she didn't come back to Ironvale. She came back to an empty den, her belongings stacked outside the boundary stones, and the pack physician waiting with a written notice that Darren had signed with his full title. The Iron Veil Pack formally withdraws its protection from the Omega designated Sarah. She is not expelled. She may remain at the boundary. Remain at the boundary. The old cruelty dressed in new language. Outside the pack's warmth, their shared hunts, their collective safety. Alive, technically. Belonging to nothing. She had known it was coming. She had known for weeks, from the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, but from the way even her few allies had begun to look slightly past her when they spoke. She had already moved what mattered to a hollow beneath the western ridge. She took her knife, her healer's kit, and the dried herbs her mother had taught her to identify, and she walked to the boundary and did not look back. She had 2 years of that. 2 years of no pack name, no territory, existing in the margins of a world built entirely around belonging. Taking border patrol contracts from packs that needed warm bodies and asked no questions. Sleeping in way stations and borrowed dens. Eating what she caught. Not soft, not broken, just reduced. Running on less than she was supposed to need, the way a fire burns low when you stop feeding it. And then came the black-sealed letter, and everything changed. Part 2. The journey to Thornhall. The royal escort arrived at dawn, as promised. 2 Kingsguard wolves in silver-threaded armor who moved with the careful stillness of people trained to see threats in empty rooms. The taller one stepped forward. "Omega Sarah, I am Captain Wren of the King's Guard. You are to accompany us to Thornhall." Sarah looked at them, at their horses, magnificent dark animals with the royal brand on their flanks, at the traveling carriage behind them, far finer than anything she had ridden in. "Can you tell me what this is about?" "No," Wren said, not unkindly. "But I can tell you that the king does not summon people to frighten them. When His Majesty wants someone frightened, he sends different messengers." Sarah looked at her knife, sheathed on her belt. She got in the carriage. The journey to Thornhall took 2 days through mountain passes that she had patrolled herself once, for a pack that hadn't bothered to remember her name. The carriage was warm, which she hadn't expected. Real food appeared at intervals, hot, well-made, the kind of meal that assumed the person eating it deserved to be fed rather than merely fueled. She ate slowly and looked out the window at the landscape she knew well from the outside, from the cold side, from the side of someone passing through rather than belonging. On the first evening, the younger guard, a woman named Peter, which was a man's name given to her by parents who had wanted a son and gotten something better, sat across from her and asked carefully whether she had been to Thornhall before. "No." "It's large," Peter said. "It can be overwhelming at first. I just wanted to say so, in case it helps to be warned." Sarah looked at her. "Why are you being kind to me?" Peter seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why wouldn't I be?" Sarah didn't have an answer to that. She had spent 2 years in spaces where the answer was obvious, where the reasons for unkindness were so structural and assumed that no one bothered to state them. She looked back out the window. "Tell me about the king," she said. Peter considered this. "He's fair. He's the kind of alpha who actually reads the border reports instead of just signing them. He asks questions that make people uncomfortable." She paused. "I think you'll understand each other." "I've been told making people uncomfortable is a character flaw." "By who?" "My former alpha." Peter made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained the same opinion. "Why, His Majesty would disagree." Wren spoke from outside the carriage, his voice carrying clearly through the window. "He's also been known to hold grudges for roughly 4 centuries against anyone who wrongs someone under his protection." "That's reassuring and terrifying simultaneously," Sarah said. "Yes," Peter agreed. "That tracks." Part 3. Thornhall. Thornhall was large. That word was insufficient, but it was the only one she had at first approach. The royal seat of the 7 bloodlines had been built over 6 generations, each one adding to what the last had considered complete, until the result was something that had stopped resembling a fortress, and become instead a place, sprawling across the high ridge, its towers lit amber in the evening light, Its lower reaches thick with the activity of a settlement that housed perhaps 3,000 permanent residents. Wildflowers grew along the approach road. Someone had planted them deliberately, in between the formal hedgerows, pushing through the careful geometry with cheerful disregard for the plan. It made her smile before she could stop it. The docking of the carriage took some time. She was escorted through a series of gates and checkpoints with practiced efficiency. Not unkind, not intimidating, simply thorough. Each guard they passed nodded to Peter and looked at Sarah with open curiosity rather than suspicion. "Word travels fast here," Peter said quietly. "Everyone knows the king summoned an Omega for private audience. It hasn't happened before." "Never?" "Not in living memory." Her quarters were on the 3rd level of the residential wing, larger than she needed, and warmer than she had been in 2 years. A window looked out over the eastern valley. A fire had been laid and lit before she arrived. Clean clothes in her approximate size hung in the wardrobe, not her style exactly, but close enough that someone had paid attention to more than just dimensions. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, which was real and soft and excessive, and pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed. She was not going to cry. She refused to cry because someone had given her a warm room. That was a pathetically low bar, and she was not going to meet it. She breathed until the tightness in her chest settled back to its usual dimensions. A knock at the door. She opened it. A wolf she hadn't seen before stood in the corridor. Older, with silver at his temples and robes that indicated rank without performing it. He had the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal and retained the capacity to be surprised by it. "Omega Sarah. I am Lord Council Davon, advisor to His Majesty. I have been asked to prepare you for your audience tomorrow." She let him in. He asked questions. Thorough, careful, precise. Her background, her training, her time at Iron Vale, her years on the border. He did not comment on any of it. He listened the way people listen when they are assembling a picture, rather than confirming a prejudice. At the end, he was quiet for a moment. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "you will learn why His Majesty has summoned you. What you learn may change your understanding of events you believed you already understood. I've had enough surprises recently. One more," he said. "I believe you'll find it worthwhile." He left. She sat by the fire and looked at the flames and tried very hard not to think about all the ways this could still be a trap. Part 4. The Throne Room. The king's throne room was not what she expected. She had imagined the usual performance of power, high ceilings designed to make people feel small, cold stone, elaborate displays of military achievement. What she found instead was a room that felt, strangely, like a library that had grown ambitious. Books lined the walls between tapestries. A fire burned in a hearth large enough to stable a horse. The ceiling was high, yes, but the light that came through the tall windows was warm, morning light without the architectural cruelty of spaces built to intimidate. King Aldrich Vane was standing at the far window when she entered. He turned, and she had a moment, just one, to see him before the political reality of what she was looking at reasserted itself. Tall, but not in the performing way of men who've been told their size is their power. Dark-haired, with the kind of face that had been lived in rather than merely occupied. His pack mark, the 7-wolf sigil of the royal bloodline, was visible at his collar, amber against his skin. He was younger than she had expected. Or rather, he looked younger than someone who had been ruling for 22 years had any right to look. He had the kind of eyes that age gives you when you've spent the years paying attention, rather than simply accumulating them. He looked at her directly. Not through her, not past her, at her, in the way she had stopped expecting from anyone. "Omega Sarah," he said. His voice was even, no performance, no rank weight added to make her smaller. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't given the option of declining." The corner of his mouth moved. "No, I apologize for that. The form of a royal summons doesn't allow for phrasing that sounds more like an invitation, and I needed you to actually come." She blinked. He gestured to 2 chairs near the fire. Not the throne. Chairs, arranged for a conversation between people who were going to sit down together. She sat. He sat. No one else was in the room. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "Yes, and I want an honest answer, not a careful one. I only know how to give honest ones. I'm aware. That's part of why you're here." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "What do you think happened to you at Iron Vale?" The question hit her without warning, which she suspected was intentional. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I saw things Darren didn't want seen, and said things he didn't want said. So he reduced me to the boundary by increments until the final step, the formal notice, was just paperwork at the end of a process that had already been completed." "And the Eastern Settlement? The resource shortages you reported?" Her eyes sharpened. "How do you know about that?" "Because 6 months after you were removed from Iron Vale," King Aldrich said carefully, "the Eastern Settlement sent a formal complaint to the Royal Council. 18 families near starvation. 3 deaths over winter that a proper food allocation would have prevented." He paused. "The complaint named you. They said you had warned Darren a year before, and been reassigned to the border for it." Sarah felt something cold move through her chest. 3 deaths. Yes. She had known about the shortages. She had not known about the deaths. Darren had made sure she wouldn't. By the time winter killed anyone, she was already gone. "What happened to Darren?" she asked. Her voice was very controlled. "He was removed from his position 4 months ago following a full council investigation. His pack has a new alpha, a young beta woman named Kor, who has already redistributed the resource allocations and sent reparations to the Eastern Settlement." Sarah looked at the fire. "You could have sent me a letter," she said, "informing me. You didn't need a royal summons for that." "No," he agreed. "That's not why I summoned you." He stood and moved to a table near the window. On it sat an object she hadn't noticed when she entered. A small wooden box, the kind used for important documents or ceremonial objects. He brought it back and set it on the low table between their chairs. "At the Battle of the Greywater Crossing," he said, 2 years ago, before Iron Vale cast you out, you were still under their banner." She went still. Greywater. She hadn't spoken that name aloud since it happened. "You were part of a scouting party that intercepted a plague carrier moving through the pass," he continued. "The carrier was moving toward a field hospital. 300 wounded soldiers and 40 civilian healers." Sarah said nothing. She knew what she had done. She lived with it the way you live, with things that were necessary and terrible simultaneously. "Your scouting party's orders were to observe and report. Your commanding officer had retreated when the carrier's infection stage became apparent. Standard protocol. The standard protocol would have let 300 people die." "Yes," he said quietly. "It would have. Which is why you didn't follow it." She had gone in alone. She had driven the carrier away from the pass using herself as bait, leading it 3 miles into the eastern ravine, where the terrain gave her an advantage, and she had handled it there, alone, with a wound in her side and 2 broken fingers from the initial engagement. She had sealed the pass and walked back to the field hospital and told the healer in charge what had happened, and then sat down outside in the snow because she hadn't been able to stand any longer. She had never reported it to Iron Vale. She had known what Darren would do with the information. He would take the credit and find a reason to sanction her for the protocol breach. "How do you know about this?" she asked. The healer in charge of that field hospital wrote a full account 3 months later when she gave testimony to the Plague Commission. She named you, specifically, precisely, with dates and details. He paused. "The account was in a secondary report that my predecessor's office had filed and never acted on. I found it 8 weeks ago when I was reviewing the Commission's full records." He opened the box. Inside was a medal. She recognized the design, the 7 wolves arranged in a circle, which was old heraldry, older than Thornhall itself. But the configuration was different from the standard military decoration. The wolves faced outward rather than inward. The Order of the Open Pack, she said, reading the inscription on the inner lid of the box. She had heard of it only in history. A theoretical honor. Given, according to the old accounts, only when someone acts to protect those to whom they owe no obligation at great personal cost. I looked through our records, King Aldrich said. It has been awarded 4 times in the last 6 centuries. 2 warriors, 1 healer, 1 cartographer who refused to falsify maps that would have led a settlement into uninhabitable terrain. He met her eyes. You would be the 5th. She stared at the medal. Your Majesty, she said carefully, I was following my conscience, not performing an act worthy of historical record. That, he said, is what makes it worthy of historical record. He closed the box and slid it toward her. I am also formally requesting that the Royal Council review and reverse the terms of your removal from Ironvale, either with full restoration of pack rights and the option, not the obligation, of a place here, if you want it. Sarah looked at the box, at him, back at the box. Why does the option matter to you? She asked. Most alphas simply make the decision. Because you've spent 4 years having decisions made for you by people who had no right to make them. His voice was level. You're not a resource to be allocated, Sarah. You're a person with a will and a preference. The option matters because you matter. The room was very quiet. She had not cried in 2 years. She had trained herself out of it in the first difficult months, in the cold, in the way stations, in the hollow under the western ridge. She was not going to cry now in a throne room in front of a king who was watching her with the careful, steady attention of someone who understood that presence was more useful than comfort. She breathed slowly, once, twice. I have a question, she said. Ask it. The people in that field hospital, the soldiers, the healers, did they all survive? All 340 of them, he said. Most returned to active duty. 7 of the civilian healers trained others who went on to treat plague survivors across 4 territories. He paused. Their survival had consequences that extended well past the original numbers. She nodded slowly. She had not known. She had not had the standing to ask, after Greywater. She had not had a pack to bring the information home to. She had simply done what she did, and walked back into the cold and tried not to examine what it had cost her. 3 years, she said. I've been walking border patrols for packs that don't know my name, sleeping in borrowed dens, eating on the margins. Yes, he said, and I am sorry for that. Not as the king. That's an institutional failure that requires institutional remedy, and we'll address it. As a person. His voice was quiet. I am sorry that you did something that required that kind of courage, and were not only unrecognized but actively punished for it. She looked at him. He was not performing the apology. He was not using it to construct a dynamic in which he was the rescuer and she the rescued. He said it the way you say something true when you know it's insufficient, and you say it anyway, because the insufficiency doesn't excuse the silence. What do you want from me? She asked. In exchange for this. Nothing, he said. On alphas always want something. That's been your experience. It isn't a universal law. He leaned back slightly, and for the first time she caught something beneath the careful steadiness of him. Something that was tired in the way that people are tired when they have been doing an enormous thing for a long time without anyone noticing the weight of it. I want to correct an injustice. I want the pack laws regarding Omegas on Border Patrol to change, and your case will be part of that argument. I want... He stopped, reconsidered, started again with something more honest. I want to know people like you exist in the world and are not being wasted in way stations. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, the option you mentioned, a place here. Yes. What would that look like? He seemed to relax slightly, not with relief exactly, more like a person who had been holding something very carefully and was now allowed to set it down with proper attention rather than urgency. Whatever it needs to look like, he said. I have a tracking division that is currently led by someone who is competent and would benefit enormously from working alongside someone exceptional. I have a border review commission that needs someone who has actually lived what they'll be reviewing. He paused, and the corner of his mouth moved again. I have a great deal of territory, and very few people who will tell me when I'm wrong. I've been told that's a character flaw. By Darren of Ironvale? Yes. I'll take it as a recommendation. She looked at the box on the table between them, at the metal inside it, which was real and old, and meant something to a history she hadn't expected to be part of. She thought about the way station she had been sleeping in before the summons arrived, the patrol contract she had signed that paid in dried goods and temporary shelter. The 2 years of boarders and borrowed warmth, and the specific loneliness of existing in the margins of a world built entirely around belonging. She thought about the field hospital, and the 340 people, and the 7 healers who had trained others who had saved others, consequences extending outward from a single decision made alone in a pass, in a blizzard with 2 broken fingers, and a wound in her side. Small actions, long shadows. I'm not easy, she said. I should tell you that clearly. I notice things that make people uncomfortable. I say them. I don't do it to cause problems. I do it because I cannot look away from things that are wrong, and I have tried, and I can't. I know, he said. I read the Iron Veil records carefully. And that doesn't concern you. Sarah. He met her eyes directly. I have been governing 7 bloodlines for 22 years. The thing that concerns me is not people who notice what's wrong. It's people who notice and say nothing, because they've learned that silence is safer. He paused. I am very tired of people who have learned that silence is safer. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. No performance, no alpha weight added. Just a person, steady and present, waiting for her to decide. 1 season, she said finally. I'll stay for 1 season. You see what this looks like in practice, rather than description. That's fair. And if I decide to leave after that, then you leave, with full pack rights restored, a letter of standing from the Royal Seal, and the Border Patrol contract regulations I intend to reform regardless, because they're exploitative and I should have addressed them 3 years ago. She blinked. You were already going to do that. Yes. So this wasn't a negotiation. No, it was a conversation. He stood and offered his hand, a human gesture, she realized, adopted somewhere in Thornhall's history, and kept because it communicated something the Pack Customs didn't quite manage. Everything I've offered you exists independently of whether you stay. The option to stay is just that. An option. She looked at his hand. She thought about the 2 years of borders, of borrowed dens, of the Eastern Ridge Hollow, where she had kept what mattered, because she'd learned not to keep it anywhere that could be taken. She thought about what it would mean to have someone notice the weight of something without being asked to put it down. She took his hand. His grip was warm and steady, and he did not add anything to it. No dominance, no reassurance. Nothing except the simple fact of contact. 1 season, she said. 1 season, he agreed. Outside the throne room windows, the morning had fully arrived. Light came through the glass and caught the metal in its box, and for a moment the 7 wolves on its face seemed almost to move. She was not a person who believed in signs. But she let herself look at it for a moment longer than necessary. The formal ceremony was small. The Lord Council, the Captain of the Guard, 2 senior council members. King Aldrich presented the Order of the Open Pack without theatrical flourish, the way you present something meaningful, when you understand that meaning is already present, and performance would only diminish it. Afterward, Petter walked her back to her quarters through corridors that were beginning to feel slightly less foreign. Well, Petter said. Well, Sarah said. That's not an answer. I'm staying for a season. Petter made a sound of quiet satisfaction. The tracking division is good people, she said. except for Torvin, who is competitive in the way that stops being charming after the first week. But he responds well to being outdone without comment. Just do the thing better and don't mention it, and he comes around. Sarah thought about this. I can do that. I know. That's why I'm telling you. They stopped at her door. Can I ask you something? Sarah said. Yes. How did the king know about Greywater? He said he found the healer's testimony in a secondary report, but he said he'd been reviewing those records for 8 weeks. That's not something you do without a reason. Petter was quiet for a moment. He grew up in the border territories, she said finally, before he became king. His mother was from a small pack on the eastern ridge. He knows what the margins look like from the inside. She paused. He's been reviewing those reports because he's been looking for the names that got buried. People who did necessary things and were never acknowledged because the systems that were supposed to see them were looking somewhere else. Sarah stood with her hand on the door. He's been looking for people like me. He found quite a few, Petter said. You're the first who ended up here for a private audience, but the others have had their records corrected, their sanctions reviewed, their patrol contracts renegotiated. She shrugged. He doesn't announce it. It's not the kind of thing he does for the credit. Sarah opened her door, stood for a moment in the threshold of a warm room with a fire and a window and food she hadn't needed to track herself. Petter, she said. Yes? Thank you for the kindness on the journey. Petter looked at her with the expression of someone who still, genuinely, did not understand why it would require thanks. Of course, she said, as if there had never been another option. Sarah went inside and closed the door. She sat in the chair by the window, and looked out at the valley below Thornhall, at the forests she knew from the outside, from the cold side, from the perspective of someone passing through. The medal sat on the table beside her. She did not pick it up, but she looked at it for a long time. She thought about the field hospital and the blizzard and the 2 broken fingers. She thought about the eastern settlement and the 3 deaths she hadn't known about, and the weight of the thing she hadn't let herself feel because feeling it in the margins would have cost her too much to bear. She let herself feel it now. The loss of 4 years. The specific grief of being good at something in a world that had decided she wasn't. The waste of it. Not self-pity, just clear-eyed accounting. The waste of what she could have been doing, what she could have been building, if Darren of Ironvale had been a different kind of man. She felt it completely, the way she hadn't let herself, and then she let it settle. Not disappear. Not be fixed. Settle. The way sediment settles in water that has finally been allowed to be still. Outside the light moved across the valley. 1 season, she had said. She looked at the metal, at the window, at the door through which Pater had walked away with the easy, unperformed kindness of someone who had been raised to believe it was simply what you did. 1 season, she thought, and then we'll see. She had done her duty in a blizzard with broken fingers and no one watching. She had reported what she saw and been punished for seeing it. She had walked the margins of a world built around belonging and survived every winter the margins threw at her. And then a king had read a secondary report in an archive that no one had bothered to look at in 3 years, and had read her name, and had sent a black-sealed letter to a way station on the border. That is how justice works sometimes. Not in declarations, not in ceremonies, in someone deciding to read all the way to the end of the report, in someone deciding that the buried names deserved to be found. Sarah had done what was right without knowing how much it mattered. Now she was going to find out.